Apreciados amigos y amigas, qué alegría que estemos todos juntos aquí en la Iglesia de Todos los Santos. Dear friends, what a joy it is that we are here together this morning at All Saints Church. Mi nombre es Mike Kinman. My name is Mike Kinman. Soy rector. I am the rector. Mi pronombre son él. My pronouns are he, him. We have quite a Sunday here as we go live. We're back on Zoom because the pandemic is spreading so quickly. Out of an abundance of caution, we're going back on Zoom for at least 3 weeks, and we will not be live streaming from the sanctuary of the church. Please, wherever you are, we hope you're just keep wearing your mask, keep washing your hands, be safe. And if there's anything that we can do for you, please let us know. Periodically, we're going to be putting resources in the chat feature about the National Domestic Violence Hotline, because we know home is not a safe place for everyone. Also, the Trevor Project, which is an amazing resource, particularly for LGBTQ youth. And so please make use of those resources as you need them, and do not hesitate to contact us here at All Saints Church if there's anything that you need. At our Sunday food table today, we gave out 41 boxes of food and 75 masks. A big thank you to Erica and everyone who was out at All Saints this morning. Also, when the pandemic started, we began to support some of the local organizations with which we have strong ties as our partners in love, because we wanted to ensure that their good work continued during these challenging times. Our partner in love this week is Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. BLMLA is the original chapter of the global movement built to challenge state-sanctioned violence against Black people and to vision and build a just and free society. Their work includes nonviolent direct action, policy work, movement building, strengthening alliances, community self-care, and creative engagement. Going into the chats and comments are ways, a link that you can go to give to BLMLA. Please support them and give as generously as you can. Now on to our forum. Our forum this Sunday is titled, "This is Who We Really Are, White Nationalism, Christian Nationalism, and the Future of Democracy." And by the title of that, you can probably tell that this is going to be just scratching the surface of things that I hope that we'll be able to dive more deeply into in weeks and months to come. The attempted coup at the Capitol on January 6th was not an isolated incident. It was the latest in the resurgence of forces whose goal is the destruction of American democracy, particularly through the silencing and oppression of Black and brown people and the institution of an allegedly Christian theocracy. This is nothing new. It did not end with the failure to take the Capitol on January 6th. So this morning, we are honored to have 4 extraordinary guests to look at the roots of what happened, what we can expect perhaps even today and in the future, and what we as a church that walks with a revolutionary Jesus committed to justice and prioritizing care of the most vulnerable among us can do about it. So I want to introduce you briefly to our 4 guests, and I'm going to invite them to share a little bit from their perspectives. Let's start with Steve Williams. Most of you know Steve is a member of the vestry here at All Saints Church. He is also president and producer at Kite Flyer Productions. He is a storyteller. Man, is Steve a storyteller. With a decade-long career as an executive at NBC Universal. He produces projects that touch the human spirit, and among the ones he's working on currently is a documentary about the history of redlining in the US. Steve, good to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Jeanelle Austin joins us from Minneapolis, where she is the creator of the Racial Agency Initiative, a racial justice leadership coaching company. She's also the lead caretaker of the George Floyd Memorial, where she guides a team of volunteers to stand in the unique space of preservation and protest. And actually, this is something I hope everyone does right now really quick. You can be a part of this work by joining the George Floyd Memorial's Million Donor Campaign. And it's on the website, www.georgefloydglobalmemorial.org. We're going to put this in the chat. They're looking for 1 million people to give at least $1 to simply make the statement that the people are building this memorial. So you can click and give to that. Jeanelle has a BA in Christian Ministries from Messiah College, an MDiv in Ethics, and an MA in Intercultural Studies from Fuller. And she's the previous Director of Operations for the William E. Pannell Center for African American Church Studies here in Pasadena at Fuller. Jeanelle, it's great to see you again.
It's really good to see you all and to be here. Thank you.
You bet. Andre Henry is a musician, writer, and organizer who specializes in helping people understand nonviolent struggle. He helped birth Subversive Liturgy, a weekly community lament of police violence after the killing of Jared Thomas by the Pasadena Police Department in 2016. He writes regularly on Medium and curates his Hope and Hard Pills podcast, which explores practical insight on racial justice and social change. And you can keep up with Andre by signing up for his email list on his website. That's going in the chat. It's andrehenry.co. Andre, great to have you back.
Good to be here, as always.
Thanks. And Katherine Stewart. Katherine is an investigative reporter and an author who's covered religious liberty, politics, policy, and controversies over the separation of church and state for over a decade. Her latest book is The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. It pulls back the curtain on the machinery of the movement that brought Donald Trump to power, taking readers inside key gatherings and strategy meetings and introducing them to the movement's most intriguing personalities. Her journalism appears in the New York Times op-ed. You might have seen her excellent piece this past week in the Times on the roots of Josh Hawley's rage. She's also been on NBC, the Washington Post, and the New York Review of Books. And in the link in the chat, we're going to put how you order her book. I ordered the audiobook and then realized it wasn't enough just to listen to it. I needed to underline so much in it that I went to Romans and got the hardback. So cannot recommend this book highly enough. And so welcome and thanks for everyone. And welcome, Katherine. Steve, I want to start with you. We said you are, among other things, a documentary filmmaker. You bring an amazing historical perspective to bear on current events. Really, the idea for this forum came out of this conversation that you and I had earlier this week about some of the historical precedents and roots of what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. And I'd love for you to talk about that for a little bit and any other thoughts you have about what we're facing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. First of all, I want to give honor to all of the indigenous people and the Native Americans that occupied the space that we are in, and to all of the ancestors, to Martin Luther King, who is being honored this weekend, and whose words speak so eloquently to exactly where we still are to this day and stuff. So I just wanted to really say that. One of the things I wanted to address when you introduced, you mentioned redlining, that my project was centered around, and that's not really quite correct, but what it does really center around, it centers around land and the occupation and the separation and the exclusion of African Americans from owning land and gaining economic wealth. It is something that ultimately the subject that we're talking about today is rooted in, as a matter of fact. White violence and the disruption of safe places for African Americans to live is really what this really is all about. Whether it is a physical violence, which was the roots of the migration and the search for a safe place for African Americans for 40 years as they migrated out of the South into the North, but also from the fact that it has manifested itself in a lot of other things other than physical violence, but mental violence, psychological violence, the lack of resources to be poured in our neighborhoods that starve our communities. And its roots are really back into the Emancipation Proclamation of 1865. And one of the reasons was that there was always the intent of those landowners and those who were owner of property of enslaved people, never, ever to agree to be on an equal level with them. Whether it was to do business, whether it was to allow them to thrive in spaces, this goes back a ways. So I think one of the things, and for me, my journey that got me to this spot, because I'm not a historian by nature at all, it was really me digging in my family's history, who my parents came from Texas, and my dad and my mom came from Louisiana, and ultimately made their way to Central California, right? Because they were not sharecroppers, but their parents worked on the farms, following the crops, right? Which a lot of African Americans did that came out west from Texas all the way up to Seattle as the seasons changed. But my mom and dad were really the first ones from their family to move to the city, into an urban space. And my question came to me is like, how did they end up there? And how did they end up to the neighborhood where we grew up? And what were the obstacles that they didn't know existed in the system that steered them into certain places that they really didn't know? One of the things that is really kind of an interesting thing that we came out in our discovery was that everybody's heard this phrase 40 acres and a mule, right? 40 acres and a mule was we think of it as this mythological thing that never really existed. But after the war was over, there was a meeting between Friedman, right, and General Sherman. And General Sherman asked them, what is it now that the war is over, right? And what is it that you want out of your life to be better and thrive? And they said, 40 acres and a mule and a place where we don't have to deal with any white people. Okay, that was safety for them, right? Because after all those years of terrorism and terrorizing, they just wanted a place to be and thrive on their own, having land and having safety. Now, Sherman agreed to this. However, it never was instituted, right? Because Lincoln was assassinated soon after that. But the little land that was distributed, and some of it is still in hands of African-American farmers and families today. But one of the things about it was that it didn't stay in the hands of African-Americans very long because it was stolen back from them, right? So if we really look at it and jump ahead to 50 years from there in 1919, right? This is the First World War was ending, right? We had, which was a horrendous war. Woodrow Wilson was president. 1919 is infamously known as Red Summer. That was a summer where more than 26 cities across the United States, primarily west of the east of the Mississippi, right? Were destroyed by violent white rage outbreaks. Those destructions killed thousands of African Americans, destroyed and and diminished the wealth of communities all over, Tulsa, Oklahoma being one of them that people are just learning about. But the thing why I think this is really interesting, you sent me a sermon for Jennifer Baskerville
Burroughs,
right? And one of the things that she talked about in that sermon was telling our story. And one of the things that's an issue right now is that we don't know all the story, right? And we as African Americans haven't been allowed to tell our side of the story. And I think a prime example is the 1619 Project, right? Which is Hannah Nicole Jones who has put together, which is a fabulous project. I think people should really get into it because it talks about African Americans' place in this country from 400 years ago from that standpoint. One of the things that happened when that came out was she got attacked by white historians saying that she didn't have the right to tell the story the way she did. So one of the things that I'm saying is that in 1919, the story was buried of all the destruction and all the pain that happened to these African American communities, to the point where in Tulsa, they're just uncovering the graves, the mass graves of African Americans that were buried. Because why? Well, what ended up happening was that the history was buried too, right? And those are the things that, one, just as we saw the mass crowds walk away from that insurgent action, as if it was a vacation and a picnic, that's what happened during those times, right? And so in reading James Cone's book, which is The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Right? The pictures of lynchings that we saw that were gatherings of people that came to celebrate and have picnics because they knew at the end of the day, they weren't going to be held accountable. And I think that's our discussion for the year. That's our discussion going forward, is how those things really play into it and how we uncover that, not just in the South or the North, but in Pasadena also. So That's
Steve, thank you. Yeah, and two of the things that they brought with them, they brought a cross and they brought a noose.
That's right.
And that's what James Cone's talking about. And so, and they clearly didn't think that they were going to be accountable because they took selfies of themselves. So, Jeanelle, I want to jump over to you. You called what happened on January 6th an assault on Black life at the halls of the U.S. Capitol through an insurrection, and said January 6th reminded America that Black people are not safe whether we feel it or not, and the police contribute to that harm. And then on Facebook, you drew some excellent comparisons to what we saw in Washington and what you experienced, what you're still experiencing in Minneapolis following the murder of George Floyd. Can you talk a little about that, and also any other thoughts you have about what we're facing?
Absolutely. I think there are a lot of direct ties between the insurrection that took place and what we're navigating here in George Floyd Square. That's the intersection of East 38th Street and Chicago Avenue South in Minneapolis, where I grew up and where I work. And as a community, we're doing a lot of work to actually push against racism through the work of building community and practicing mutual aid. But it was kind of fascinating after the insurrection, so many people tried to say that somehow that the George Floyd protesters were the start of all this. Had we not protested, then somehow these people who were insurrectionists wouldn't got the idea in their mind to go and take over the Capitol. Like, yeah, no. The whiteness is deep in our nation. What we saw in that insurrection was an image of the white mobs that our ancestors would have seen during Jim Crow. And that element has been traumatizing for me. And as I think about that, it's also been eye-opening because I think about when I was in Texas for a short stint of time, I remember the energy in Texas just felt absolutely depressing. And the hopelessness, it was thick in the air within the African-American community. And watching that insurrection, watching that white mob, watching the selfies being taken, watching the cross being erected, watching the gallows like being moved into the Capitol live, I began to realize if I had experienced that every single week, and if that was the threat to my family every single day, yeah, I'd probably be seriously hopeless as well. Like the harm caused to the African-American community during the Jim Crow era, during slavery, like it makes more sense to me now in terms of the kind of trauma that we are continuing to try to work through as an African-American community. But I've never witnessed a white mob like that until January 6th. And safety, Steve, you had talked about like the significance of land and safety. That is something that we constantly talk about at George Floyd Square in terms of if we're going to be able to build capacity within the Black community and actually pursue Black liberation, we need to have ownership. And when we talk about safety, we have a lot of neighbors who are saying, well, I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe to walk my dog. We need more police officers on the ground and things like that. But no one actually thinks about the fact that as Black people, we don't feel safe because white people exist around us. And that is a hard truth to navigate. And what does it take to actually think about the safety of Black bodies in America? The fact that that insurrection was riddled with images of anti-Blackness. And so where some people want to say, oh, that was an attack on the Capitol, it was also assault on Black bodies. To say that we still believe that we are more superior than you. White-bodied supremacy is a language that many authors use. I love Ta-Nehisi Coates, that people who believe themselves to be white, right? That idea that we should have more power than you simply because we are white. And I saw some people say, well, there wasn't all white people. There are some Black folks in the images as well. It's like, yep, those were misguided Black people. People who believe themselves to be white. And that that's a whole other conversation.
Mhm.
But I think it's important to understand that what happened at the Capitol, the images, the way in which they moved as a mob, the way in which they took photos, the way in which they looted. In Minneapolis, the president of the United States put out, if you're looting, we're shooting. And then they
Mhm.
sent the National Guard in. But then at the Capitol, he was like, we love you. We love you. Like, and they're walking out with the podium from the House floor. Like, people walked out with toilet paper at Target, and they get rubber bullets. But people walk out with a podium from the House floor, and they get, we love you.
Mhm.
Like, help me. Somebody help me understand the inequities that continue to exist in the United
Mhm.
States of America. We are greeted with National Guard for the thought of protesting peacefully.
Mhm.
And they were greeted with nothing. And they came in with guns, gallows that were like 40 feet high. How did you miss that? Like, that's what I'm trying to figure out. How did you miss
Yeah.
that? They erected crosses. Like, come on. And it wasn't just like young people. It was young, old, male, female, like potentially genders in between. I don't know. There were people who were able-bodied, people who were non-able-bodied. Like, I just like, watching the images, I struggled deeply with this inequities of race that continue to exist within our political system, within our nation, with the heartbeat of our DNA, that it allows Black people to continue to be oppressed.
Mhm.
And no one actually cares. They care, they care more about them being able to get like their way, their power, or quote unquote having peace. And they actually care what is continuing to happen to Black bodies in America, Black communities, Black culture, Black thought. And so I stayed on Black Twitter to heal
Mhm.
and to laugh my way through it. I don't know if I'm healed, but I just needed to be able to get through. So Black Twitter and Black Jesus were my saving grace.
Thank you, Jeanelle. I want to jump over to Andre. Andre, you've been talking about a coup for months, both in terms of what happened on Epiphany, but also in terms of Gene Sharp's The Anti-Coup. So we could go in a lot of different directions. What I'm wondering is, looking at the intersection of three things that you have personal experience with and you've openly repudiated. The first is the neo-Confederacy and white nationalism. The second is the dominionist theology and evangelical fundamentalism. I'm thinking about your playing hooky song. And the third is the role of the police in suppression of democracy. So I would love to hear your thoughts on the intersection of these three things, and then anything else you'd like to throw in there.
For sure. When I was a kid, I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, mind you. So I grew up in the city where the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan was founded, on the rock that they call Stone Mountain. It's a rock, it's not a mountain. That's not how mountains are made. That's another subject. But they stand on top of this large rock over 1,000 feet in the air, and they light a cross for the first time after seeing a cross being burned in D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. The Klan didn't burn crosses before that movie was made. So here's an instance of life imitating art. I grew up in that city, and I remember going to church in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and we had these nationalistic rituals, right, as children. One was, even in school, we would stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, sing the national anthem. But at church, we would add another ritual, and there was something called the Christian flag. I don't know if everybody's familiar with it, but there's a white flag with a little blue box in the corner, and there's a red cross in there. We would pledge allegiance to the Christian flag and to the Savior to which it stands, one brotherhood uniting all true Christians in service and in love. I forgot about the Christian flag. Hadn't seen it in a very long time. Probably the last time I saw it was in 2016 at some church, and I went, oh wow, there's a Christian flag in here. The last time I saw the Christian flag, though, was on January 6, 2021. I saw the Christian flag in the Senate chamber. I saw the Christian flag in the hands of insurrectionists who were willing to try to overturn the election. So if we want to talk about the intersection between, racism, well, we saw the Blue Lives Matter flag, we saw the Don't Tread on Me flag, we saw the Confederate flag, and we saw the Christian flag all in one place.
Mhm.
I don't think I need to say more than that. If we want to see the intersection, we just saw it. But I do want to read something to you, since we're honoring Dr. King. As Jeanelle was saying, hashtag not all white people, I was reminded of something that Dr. King said that doesn't get enough credit. I'm sitting in the land of my ancestors in Jamaica, in Montego Bay, where Dr. King was once in 1967, where he wrote his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, while he was in this city. And while he was in this city, he wrote these words, and they've been ringing in my ear as I've been trying to talk to people about the potential for coups and preparations for anti-coups and all that kind of stuff. And he says, the context that he's talking about, whenever there is any type of racial progress, there's always a backlash from white America. That's what he says. And then he writes this characterization is necessarily general. It would be grossly unfair to admit recognition of a minority of whites who genuinely want authentic equality. Their commitment is real, sincere, and is expressed in 1,000 deeds. But they are balanced at the other end of the pole by the unregenerate segregationists who have declared that democracy is not worth having if it involves equality. The segregationist goal is the total reversal of all reforms, with the reestablishment of naked oppression and, if need be, a native form of fascism.
Amen.
A native form of fascism. Dr. King saw this in 1967. He wasn't the only one. When Malcolm X talks about how the police used to stop and search Black people in their neighborhoods, he said that the police come in because the police use the media, he said, to convince white America that Black people are a criminal element in American society, and that gives them the right to go in, and he says, with quote, Gestapo tactics into the Black community. Anti-Blackness has always been the seam of democracy in this country. That is the place where our so-called liberal democracy ends, right? And we don't want to admit, when we talk about, the title of this forum, that this is who we are. We don't want to admit that fascism, authoritarianism, even totalitarianism have been a part of the American political tradition since its inception. And Black people have been trying to tell people that for years. And now we're in an iRobot situation or an Iron Man 3 situation, one of them. Because we've invented this technology, the foot soldiers, to guard this regime of violence and this human hierarchy and this regime of inequality. We have these foot soldiers, these guardians that we invest trillions of dollars in to make sure that they are weaponized and that they have all the equipment that they need to uphold this situation of inequality. And look what happened. The cops attacked the Capitol. Who'da thunk it? The cops. The off-duty cops attack the on-duty cops. It's cop on cop. And Black people have been trying to warn this country for centuries. This democracy is at least incomplete, if not a lie.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I'm saying is, now when we talk about defunding the police and all that kind of stuff, that it's essential because the thing that was invented to oppress some people is now affecting all Americans. And that was bound to happen. All of America is living in a window of white supremacist terror at this very moment, because these same white supremacist Christian insurrectionists have threatened to seize more Capitol buildings between the 17th, which is today, and Inauguration Day. And there are people who are scared and worried and concerned, which is the definition of terror.
Mm-hmm.
I keep thinking of this psalm that says, the pit that they dug for me, they have fallen into themselves.
Mm-hmm.
that is what is happening in America. People started talking about this coup in 2017. In 2017, there were articles being published that what Trump was doing with the what do you call that? So, the immigration ban,
Right,
and
the Muslim ban.
yeah, the Muslim ban and the things at the southern border. There were people already talking about this possibly being a trial balloon for a coup. And here we are. You know, I don't know what else to say. It's like this country has never taken white supremacy seriously. And we saw this happen again January 6th with the FBI letting law enforcement know that something's going to happen January 6th. These people organized this stuff in broad daylight. They were on Parler, they were on Reddit, they were on social media talking about how they were going to do something. And then when they're attacked, you got one lady saying, with shock, they pushed me down and maced me. They said, what? Well, what were you trying to do? Well, it's a revolution. How do y'all think revolutions go? Do you think that you just attack Capitol buildings and they walk you in on the red carpet? But they're telling us what America has been unwilling to admit. And I've been going for a while, so I'm going to stop. But they're telling us what America has been unwilling to admit is that we know that the police were not invented so that they could protect everybody. They did not expect to be treated like they did not expect the police to protect and serve everybody else against what they were doing, right? Someone else complaining that was reported through the nation. They're treating us like, or they should be shooting at Black Lives Matter, they said, but they're shooting at us, is what they said. So they know that this is supposed to be a situation of inequality. So basically the intersection that I'm saying is that anti-Blackness has always been directly connected to our claims about the kind of political system that we have, right? It is no surprise to me that what began in the summer with this global uprising against systemic racism has put us in touch with the fragility of our democracy in general, because this has always been the thing that Black people are saying, is that we are only as democratic as we treat Black people in this country.
Thank you, Andre. I want to jump over to Katherine, and sort of talk about the Christian flag a little bit. I'm just finishing your book. There's so many places we could go with this. Your area of expertise is this rise of Christian nationalism. So I want to read just one paragraph from your book, talking about President Trump, whom you were talking to. I think it's Ralph Drollinger, and he said that he believes Trump excels in the biblical criteria for leadership. And you say Trump, of course, is the man who, by all accounts, has the least claim of any public figure in recent memory to those virtues that are commonly identified as Christian. That is perhaps precisely why leaders like Drollinger embrace him. While many Americans still believe that the Christian right is primarily concerned with values, leaders of the movement know it's really about power. Trump's supposedly anti-Christian attributes are in fact part of the attraction. Today's Christian nationalists talk a good game about respecting the Constitution and America's founders, but at bottom, they prefer autocrats to Democrats. Trump believes in the rule of force, not the rule of law. He is not there to uphold values, but to impose the will of the tribe. He is a leader perfectly suited to the cause. Can you talk about that? Can you talk a little about the dominionist theology that is underneath this and how it propelled the Trump presidency and what happened on January 6th?
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to thank first my fellow panelists for your insights and your really thought-provoking analysis. Trump is a symptom of this problem, and he's also an exacerbator of the problem, but he's not its cause. I mean, I think what we saw on full display on January 6th is the fact that there's this political movement in our country that is hostile to democracy and also hostile to the truth. And the movement has a number of roots, and the alliances between those who stormed the Capitol, of course, and racist groups is clear. But no analysis is really complete if it fails to take into account Christian nationalism. And we really can't understand what happened without looking at the powerful role and exploitation of religious rhetoric for purposes of sort of uniting this cohort and sort of uniting and dividing and establishing the idea in America that there is a sort of a pure and an impure, sort of this strict binary. I mean, I think that there, it's abundantly clear, of course, that many capital terrorists were allied with white supremacist groups, but we really can't forget the deep connection between reactionary religion in America and racism. And since you referred to my book, I actually want to read a quote by James Henry Thornwell. He was a pro-slavery theologian. He was one of what Frederick Douglass called the $5,000 divines, the sort of well-funded theologians of that era who were actually either on the side of slavery and slaveholders or had made peace with it. And he was, as you also know, there were also abolitionist theologians who, as Douglass said, were arguing from humble pulpits. They were not well funded. They were, in many instances, sort of disregarded, and there was a lot of hostility directed toward them by the pro-slavery theologians. So this is what James Henry Thornwell wrote. He's a pro-slavery theologian from South Carolina. He was a leader of the Southern Presbyterian Church. And he was sort of summing up the conflict, right? He said, the parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. They're atheists, socialists, communists on the one side. That's this abolitionist, he said, and friends of order and regulated freedom on the other. So this is a movement that's been promoting these sort of strict binaries of the pure versus the impure, the sort of friends of order and regulated freedom, which at that time were the people who enslaved other people, and the sort of industry, those sort of moneyed interests at that time. And the important aspect of that kind of pro-slavery theology is that it fused their idea of religion with a kind of racialized form of nationalism, and we're seeing kind of echoes of that conflict playing out today. I think, there's something else that you mentioned in what you said. You talked about the leadership, and I think that there is a kind of understandable tendency sometimes to narrate these events from the perspective of the base, who are largely, but not exclusively, white evangelicals. But my research and that of others makes clear that we really need to look at this movement from the top down. We need to understand that there's a kind of elite, a Christian nationalist elite, which is, again, not exclusively evangelical. It includes some number of hyper-conservative Catholics. Movement even derives support from some individuals and groups that do not identify as Christian at all. And they've been instrumental in laying down the organizational and intellectual blueprint for an anti-democratic movement. They've been telling us for decades now that they hate our democracy, that they hate any form of government that does not reflect their values, and that the idea of a government that's where based in equality and pluralism is entirely illegitimate. And they've been telling us that they're engaged in a holy war over the very survival of our country. I mean, they've been telling us what they've been thinking all along. It's just that a lot of Americans have not been listening. And, again, Donald Trump was a symptom of this dysfunction and also an exacerbator, but he's not the source of the problem.
Can you talk a little about sort of the dominionist theology and what that is? Because it really has its roots right here in Pasadena with C. Peter Wagner and James Dobson.
Oh, wow. Yeah, C. Peter Wagner is really interesting. I mean, I think the movement has a lot of different intellectual influences and a lot of theologians who have played a really important influence over time. C. Peter Wagner is a very interesting figure because he is known as a father of a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. It's a fast-growing religious movement. And he argues that Christians, as he defines Christianity, people who adhere to a certain hyper-conservative idea of religion, sort of should take control of what he calls the 7 mountains or molders of culture and rule from them, including, finance, education, law, government, entertainment, sort of the 7 areas of culture that sort of are he identifies them as 7 mountains or molders. And he casts this as taking back dominion from Satan. And he drew very heavily from a mid-century theologian named Rusa J. Rushdoony, who was also a big fan of some of those pro-slavery theologians. Rushdoony actually not only admired and cited affirmatively folks like Robert Louis Dabney, who was a very prominent pro-slavery theologian, but Rushdoony actually reprinted some of Dabney's works through his own publishing house, Ross House Books. And Rushdoony called democracy a heresy, So this is a movement that has deep intellectual roots. It's always been kind of part of our very complicated and diverse intellectual heritage. And we're kind of seeing echoes of even some of those very extreme voices today. And what we saw in the Capitol was an absolute disgrace. I think the part that was most surprising to me, and that is extremely surprising to many other observers, is the outrageous lack of preparedness on the part of the people and organizations responsible for national security. But in a way, that failure wasn't that surprising, because one predictable part of that is of course, the incompetence of the Trump administration. But beyond that, I think there's a sort of predictable racism and the perceived minimization of risk associated with white protesters. Anyway, I want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to participate in this forum, and thanks for allowing me to learn from you guys.
Oh, you bet. I want to.
Can I comment?
Yeah, Steve, go ahead. I just people can also use the Q&A feature.
I think what you, with Katherine laid out, is really so critical, and I think it's the undertones of what we're dealing with, and how it's really the blanket thrown over our eyes, right? And I think if we look at and we read 12 Years a Slave, and which was a book that was written by a free man that was kidnapped and put back into slavery, and we see the life that happened on the plantations. Religion and the interpretation of the gospel was a weapon that was used to control and justify actions of the white majority. And I think what Katherine is really talking about is the fact that there's been an unholy alliance, right, between politicians, primarily Republican Party members, the majority, to gain control, right, with the Christian nationalists, the Christian majority, to really be I guess it would be the drug, right? The drug that ultimately covers everybody else. It is not without importance to see that the controversy in this election had to do with 5 states that had majority African-American majorities in their counties that became the deciding factors, right? And in Georgia, the Warnock position and his candidacy was destroyed from the Christian right as if he was satanic, and that his policies, now he comes out of the church of Martin Luther King as the pastor, and to try to portray him such as my own spirituality, right? African Americans, their own spirituality is unholy and rooted in what? Satanic, unspiritual things. That's totally it totally tries to negate us across the board.
Yeah. Jeanelle, go ahead and jump in.
Thank you. Absolutely. So one of the things that I've been wrestling with and thinking about, especially throughout this 8 months, we still occupy 38th in Chicago in terms of a protest zone. It's occupied with art, but and one of the things that we noticed over the last 8 months, because Minnesota is an extremely white state. Minneapolis, an extremely white city. Minneapolis also an extremely progressive city, right, on the books. But yet we still face a kind of resistance from people who are so-called progressive. And when we think of this idea or notion of like white nationalism and Christian nationalism kind of being regulated to the right, part of me wrestles with that, because there is also a kind of white nationalism that's birthed out of progressiveness, where it's white ideologies that are grabbing for political power, and they don't care about Black people either. And this notion that somehow if you're on the right, you're okay and you're good, or if you're on the right, you're bad, and those were your people and you need to get your people. But if you're on the left, then you're okay and you're good, and you're like pro BLM. Can't even say Black Lives Matter, but you got to say the initials BLM. But yet what I've been hearing has been problematic, because people will say, well, F12 and ACAB and all of these things about the police, but it has nothing to do with actually Black liberation. And so when I listen closely, it has everything to do with, being able to assume power, political power. You get political power too, then what happens to Black lives? Like, we go through the exact same thing, because history tells us that whether Republican or Democrat, Black people have been oppressed by both. Whether liberal or conservative, Black people have been oppressed by all. And so for me, in this conversation about white nationalism and Christian nationalism and how it plays out, I look at the way whiteness functions in the United States of America, politically, ideologically, and it is hard for me to reserve this conversation just for the Christian right, in terms of what's problematic, because I don't think I trust the progressive left either, because some of the political decisions that they're making are still anti-Black. And I think that too needs to be a part of the conversation, or else what we're going to get is a whole bunch of white people saying, I'm good because I'm not that kind of white. Right. We saw the same thing that happened when Donald Trump became elected. Well, I didn't vote for Donald Trump because I'm good. But have you checked your whiteness? Have you checked the white supremacy and the ways in which you move and think and vote and purchase? And like, someone tried to convince me that I needed to take on Marxist ideologies. I was like, boo, those came from Europe too. Like, until you can give me an ideology that came from Wakanda, like, I ain't trying to hear it. Like that, like, so I think it's important. So even, because otherwise we'll keep pendulum swinging. And Andre was right that what we see is white lash. Like, Barack Obama becoming president of the United States is a big reason. I was talking to someone the other day who was saying, articulating to me, like, we're in this place right now because of Barack Obama was elected as the president of the United States. If a white man had been president between 2008 and 2016, we would not be seeing this insurrection today. And I think we have to take seriously the way in which whiteness works, not just on the conservative side, but even also on the liberal side, because the way the liberals will respond and have been responding to the insurrection with this, oh my gosh, I can't believe that would have happened. Like, how did they not see it? And Black people are just sitting there just like, really? Like, been trying to tell you. So yeah, I just wanted to add that bit as well.
Yeah, and what strikes me is the Christian nationalist movement really being, frankly, excellent opportunists at this point, taking advantage of the opportunity for the backlash that happened with the Obama presidency and the continuing rise of white nationalism to see this opportunity to take someone who on some level would be an unlikely champion in Donald Trump, and on other levels, by their own definitions, is the perfect champion, and to say, we're going to use this to push our agenda. Want to tell people you can put questions in the Q&A feature. Clara Williams asks, and actually, Steve, the question isn't for you. So it's for Katherine. She says, can you give more names of leaders of this movement? And before you do that, one of the things that just made my jaw drop reading your book was talking about Drollinger's weekly White House Bible study gatherings. These are taking place in the West Wing. Here are some of the people, like 11 of 15 cabinet secretaries were attending these, including Mike Pompeo, Jeff Sessions, Betsy DeVos, Ben Carson, Scott Pruitt, Rick Perry, and occasionally Mike Pence. And so the access this movement had to the heart of political power in the West Wing was incredible. And Katherine, can you talk about some of the other leaders? Who are the names of the other leaders of this movement?
You know, it's really interesting. The movement isn't, there are a number of, you know, very important leaders, but more important than the leaders themselves are the all of the features of modern campaign infrastructure. Like the movement isn't so much leader-led as it is institution-led. So there are right-wing policy groups like the Alliance Defending Free, legal advocacy groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, or Beckett, with whom it coordinates sometimes, or Liberty Council. There are right-wing policy groups like the Family Research Council or Focus on the Family, or groups like that. There are very sophisticated data initiatives. There are very sophisticated messaging platforms. There are there's a sort of right-wing propaganda sphere, sort of, I would say, far-right propaganda sphere, a very hermetic messaging sphere that stokes fear and irrationalism and relies on half-truths or massaged truths or patent falsehoods in order to sort of persuade people, you know, to sort of be in those areas. There's you know, all of the features of modern campaign infrastructure, data, sort of messaging, and very strong networking organizations, groups like the Council for National Policy, which play an incredible role in kind of getting everybody on the same page. So the movement, you know, I focused on a number of leaders of those groups, people like, I suppose, you know, Ralph Reed, who has played an enormous role in election cycles, or folks like Tony Perkins, who's the head of the Family Research Council, and many others affiliated with him. But more important, I would say, than the leaders is the sort of you know, organizational structure, and that's what gives the movement so much power. You know, when one leader falls out, there's plenty of others to take their place, because the you know, organizations are really not dependent on any single leader, most of them.
Yeah, Andre, go ahead.
What Katherine was just saying about organization just stands out to me as just an important point that I would want to highlight. And I see a lot of language about how people are talking about January 6th, and they're saying things like the day after the coup, or what do you say after a coup attempt, and stuff like this. And I just want to be clear that, like, you know, there's a reason why, like, there's a reason why people started talking about this in 2017, right? And some maybe even before then. You know, there's a reason why, you know, when we were seeing federal agents snatch activists off the street, when Trump said that he has absolute power as president, you know, when they asked him what he's going to do if he loses the election, and he said, we'll have to see. Like, these were all, you know, Jesus says, like, you guys know that, like, when the sky turns red, it's about to rain, but you can't read the signs of the times, right? Like, we should have been interpreting this as what was coming. And we should also understand that, like, these people are not done, you know, like, they're not finished, you know. And what comes to mind, and many people have been highlighting this online, is that Hitler was a part of a failed coup in 1925. Then he was jailed, and in jail he wrote Mein Kampf. And 10 years later, he's the Chancellor of Germany, right? There's more organization in what happened than I think many people realize. You know, when we discover that there were Congress people who were in on this, you know, 7 of them from California. They're calling this the seditious 7, you know, And I just want to put out there again, we were talking about fighting racism as is appropriate on the weekend that we're remembering Dr. King. Then we have to remember that we're in a power struggle, you know? And the person who wins in this power struggle are the people who out-organize the other.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. That's what this is about right now.
So I want to jump in with that, because you know, this is sort of like, this gets to the now what piece to us. And a couple things like that you said in your book, Katherine. You said, for now, progressive religious voices have figured out only how to grab a headline here or there for the benefit of sympathetic audiences. They do not, I should say, we do not know how to seize the reins of political power. And then on the other side, you talk about United in Progress aiming to register 5 million conservative Christians in 2012. It feels like the only thing approaching what groups like United in Progress have been able to do is Stacey Abrams with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I want to throw this open to all of you. What do we do? How do we organize so that we can combat this?
Well, I'd like to throw something out there first.
Go, Andre.
There's a resource, you know, for people. There's a book called The Anti-Coup. Mm-hmm. I think it's like 76 pages long or something like that. You really could read it in a day if you want to. It's by Gene Sharp, and near the back, Gene Sharp makes a bunch of suggestions about you know, what needs to be done or what can be done, right, in order for people to organize to really fortify their democracy and to, you know, prepare for these kinds of like illegal power grabs. That's one thing that I think of. There's another organization called Choose Democracy that an organizer that I really respect called Daniel Hill. And also, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. And he's like a huge, like, George Lakey, that's his name, that they've been involved with. This is another resource that I think, you know, you could follow them on Twitter. They have an email list, and they send out emails that are analyzing what's going on right now, but they also have sent out some now what, you know, pieces, like different campaigns going on around the country that would be helpful in this kind of moment. So I would just throw those resources out there for people to check out as well.
Okay, I'm actually going to put the you can download the Anti-Coup. It's going to go right there in the chat. Others, Katherine, Steve, Jeanelle, how do we organize?
No, I want to just comment into the fact, because one of the primary battlegrounds here is education. It's really for the minds. And I think that's really one of the things that Katherine lays out, their organization and their efficiency in terms of their message. I think about it from the standpoint of when I came up, one of the most enlightening moments of my time in terms of college, when I was speaking with Claire about this, is the whole initiation of Black Studies programs. I don't know if you remember that. There was never any sort of sense of history. And the Black Studies movement was something that was considered to be subversive in colleges and high schools. We need it. We need it right now. If we really look at what's going on with some of the tactics that the Christian right is using, they are in high schools, they are in private school movements, they are in all throughout. And this is one of the places that we need to start younger. Our issues did not start now. They didn't start, I know 2017 was a really big time, as a matter of fact, because Charlottesville was a very, very eye-opening time, and how the president reacted to that was another one of those flags, I think, that Andre was talking about, that we really should have been a lot more aware of. But ultimately, what we really need to do, we need to have that movement to where we are telling our story and the real histories of what was going on. I just want to bring up a history from the past, but it's very revealing, and it has to do with the Compromise of 1850. And I suggest that people read this. The Compromise of 1850 was at a very critical time in the formation of our union, right? And it was the debate over whether California and New Mexico were going to come into the union as free states or slave states. And the battle was it's a very famous debate between three white senators, Henry Clay, Calhoun, and I think Webster were the ones. But you need to read it because it talks about the North and the South and the division and the compromise that was made in order to delay what ultimately became the Civil War. okay? And the compromise was, you can have California can be a free state, but we're going to recognize slave ownership. And in return, the South, you can have the seditious slave laws, right? And your slave property goes beyond state lines. So fugitive slaves can be taken back to the South. That satisfied it for just 10 years. But ultimately, it was a deal, right? In supremacy and the control still of those that were in the South were really the factors that the North worried about. And that's somewhat what's happening here from a religious standpoint too. There's a difference to that, right? In terms of our own sort of religious journey. And we see that.
Yeah, I want to, right now it's 11. If you all can stay with us for 10 more minutes, I'd love to keep going just for 10 minutes. Real quick, in the chat are the links to Children's Chapel with Kelly Aaron O'Phelan and the Meditation Chapel by Betty Cole. So if you want to jump off and go to those and then come back here for 11:15, you can. So we've got to educate ourselves. You know, what else do we do? I mean, like certainly like someone like William Barber is as compelling a person as we have found. And William Barber has not been able, with his Poor People's Campaign, to generate anywhere close to the kind of momentum that we're talking about. You know, it was interesting, you know, when we're talking about the 7 mountains, you know, of dominionist theology, it made me think of the pillars of support that Gene Sharp talks about in terms of organizing, that we have to cut down those pillars of support. So what do we do? What can All Saints Church do? Katherine.
So I think we need to reclaim the high ground on the idea of religious freedom. True religious freedom, as we know, is the freedom of thought, conscience, and worship. And it includes the freedom to worship any idea of sort of any spiritual or religious idea, of course. It also includes the freedom from being compelled to worship if you don't want to. It includes the freedom to define religion as you choose. And you know, they're trying to sort of hijack the idea of faith and say, you know, our faith it's our way or the highway, and it's not. I mean, I think there are many who view the sort of that sort of highly racial idea of religion as Christianity as a form of heresy, you know. So you know, they're trying to claim their right to discriminate against others as a sort of exercise of their so-called religious freedom. It isn't. It's the opposite. It's a violation of the religious freedom of so many people. So I think that's a really important part of the discussion.
Amen. Yeah, and actually Susan Russell's been putting in the chat stuff about how so much of this sounds familiar with the culture wars in the Episcopal Church. You actually write about that in your book, so that's a part of that too. Jeanelle Austin.
Absolutely. So step one, listen to Black people. I think we need to start listening to Black people. Step two, repent. And with repentance, step three comes with practicing mutual aid. I think what we find in Luke, when John the Baptist is talking to folks and they're like, what do we do? He was like, if you have 2 coats, give one away. Stop trying to ask for more than what your pay is. Be satisfied. Give more to folks who don't have what they need. Take care of people. Yeah, being able to give and receive, I think, is important. And then step 4, let the children lead. I think part of the problem that we have, Jesus said, let the children come unto me, but I'm saying let the children lead. Because this past election cycle was a whole bunch of old people. And even my great aunt, great cousin, really, she's like, Jeanelle, she's like, all these old people, she's like, they're my age. They need to sit down and let somebody young come in. And I think this idea that people have to hold on to power, and this happens on both Democratic and Republican sides. being able to let the youth lead, listen to our youth and what they're saying and what they have for an imagination and imagining a different future, a better future, and let them work that out. And then number 5, I would say, and maybe this goes before 4 actually, but being able to work on unifying the intergenerationally. I think that being able to understand the place of elders and being able to hold space for elders and listen to them, hold space for youth, listen to them, and then for all of us in between, there needs to be work of unity. Otherwise, the organizing ain't gonna happen, because we're gonna be pulling every which way. And I think with unity doesn't mean that we always have to agree, but being able to respect that we have differing opinions, being able to respect the fact that we're not monolithic, but being able to come together and actually love each other and care for each other and say, we're not going to leave anybody behind, but we're going to hold each other up, even especially the most marginalized in our community. Yeah, being able to build community is so key and so important. And because with relationships, we reduce fear of each other.
Yeah. Well, and this is the stuff that you're working on. And actually it reminds me, right in the middle of the Ferguson uprising, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor conference, Tracy Blackman was working on this, had a gathering where they took young organizers from around the country, got them together with elders in the movement like C.T. Vivian and others. And basically the design of the time together was a safe space for the young organizers, but then the elders to be available as resources, not to say, well, this is how you do it, and in my day, but to just be there, to hold space, to protect the young people, let them figure themselves out, but then also to say, we're here if you want to hear from us. And I think that model is kind of what I feel like you're talking about, which is, and we need to figure out and recapture that role of elder. And we need to let young people lead. And so thank you for everything that you said there. And I'm glad you're going into business helping people do just this. So that's really good, Jeanelle. Thank you. Andre, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to leave people with some pretty practical things as well, especially since the next few days we're likely to see more violence. Mm-hmm. You know, first off, we need to not just think in the immediate. You know, I had a friend a couple of years ago who woke up in the middle of the night unable to breathe, and he rushed to the hospital, and it took a couple of days for the doctor to figure out what happened, but it turned out that he had angina, which is it's a chest pain that's caused when you don't have enough oxygen in your blood passing through there. And so we're having a conversation about, he says, yeah, it turns out that I can't just drink as much whiskey and eat as much pizza as I want and not exercise and expect to live very long. I feel like what we saw on January 6th was like that episode in the night where my friend woke up unable to breathe, and the diagnosis has come back that America has been playing fast and loose with its political health for way too long. We cannot continue to do whatever we want and expect to have a healthy and robust democracy. Some people think that it's not their problem because it's been Black people that have been suffering first and most under our anti-democratic praxis of politics. But like I said, like this is a hint. It will affect every American eventually if we're not careful. And so a part of that is that we need to think long-term about the kind of work that needs to go into building an actual democracy in this country if we want the idea of America to be real. There needs to be a long-term pro-democracy movement with this broad base that centers on race, right? That includes civil resistance and changing our common sense on nonviolent struggle, because like what a lot of people did on January 6th is watch this and go, well, what are we supposed to do? I don't know what to do. You know, where are the police and all this kind of stuff? And this is how we get pulled back into this cycle of saying we want to abolish these anti-democratic institutions like the police, but will the police please come and intervene right now? Gene Sharp has a wonderful essay called "Making the Abolition of War a Realistic Goal," where he is applying the concepts of nonviolence to just the general citizenry. And his political imagination is so challenging to me because he actually imagines civilians being able to ward off a foreign invasion through nonviolent struggle. That's long term. We need to create that common sense. We also need to really organize around accountability to everyone who aided Donald Trump into maintaining power. Every congressperson who was a part of this event on January 6th, they need to be primaried. They need to never be able to hold office again. At the very least, I really think that they all need to be exiled. Honestly, I think that Donald Trump should be exiled as well. But since that's probably, too drastic of an imagination, they at least need to be removed from power. Because if we do not crack down on this in that way, then we might end up in a situation where 10 years from now, we're dealing with a much smarter authoritarian, or we have Donald Trump again. And in the very near future, I think that I just want to put out there that there are a lot of people who, in their head, they go, this is fascism, so we need to be out there punching Nazis and yelling at, white supremacists who will be out in the streets over the next few days. I would advise people not to do that. I don't think that there's anything to be gained in standing in front of people who are possibly armed and ready to do harm. They said it in Charlottesville in 2017, we are not nonviolent, right? And so we are talking about active shooter situations and things like that in this. Focus on power holders. These people have made a threat. They're going to try to storm more Capitol buildings, put pressure on your governors, on your mayors, on your police chiefs, and ask them what is their plan to keep people safe over the next few days. Focus on those things. And to also not get caught up in people who are attacking buildings and spaces. If there is an actual coup, right, or a second attempt at a coup, it's very important to understand that the thing that we need to preserve is the functioning of the constitutional society and government, not protecting government buildings.
Right.
So also contact your Congress people and just make sure that they have this anti-coup information. Make sure that they know that no matter what happens, y'all need to have a plan to continue the functioning of the constitutional government, even if someone controls the Senate building or the Capitol building. Very last thing, the two things that you need to know is that a coup needs legitimacy and it needs compliance. They've already proven that they don't have the legitimacy. And it doesn't seem like they have the real firepower to impose their compliance. But whatever we do, we have to continue to repudiate the coup effort, and we have to continue to refuse to comply with any orders that come from non-constitutional actors.
Amen. Thank you, Andre. Thank you. I want to, we just ran a little bit over. I want to thank you. Clearly, we want to come back with each one of you and do a lot more in depth. We've just scratched the surface. Steve Williams, Jeanelle Austin, Andre Henry, Katherine Stewart, thank you so much. We'll continue to post information about how to access the work you're doing, Katherine, to get your book right here, The Power Worshippers. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep coming back. Thank you all so much. We're going to be jumping onto our 11:15 service in just a few minutes. So thanks, everybody.